Okay, so we're going to start the second session. I'm going to do a quick overview of some things that are observations about really the mobile games for health landscape, specifically talking about also the mobile sort of social space. Some of these are they're a little bit of an older slide deck that I've done a quick update on, but I'm going to then pass it off to Dan from Zamzy, who is going to show you, I think, one of the more interesting, very targeted, gamification-based, sensor-based mobile games for health that's going on. Now, Ellen talked a little bit about Zamzy. For those of you who were here previously, Dan's going to go into a lot more detail of it. So what's coming out of this is, I think, a discussion around what I would call design and engineering patterns. What are the kinds of mobile-type games that we can develop, and who's developing, and what are some of the examples where we kind of can push beyond the whole idea of just any game played on a mobile platform to specific games that have mobile affordances. So we can look at this as just being there are mobile games or social games, but these worlds are sort of colliding. And just to be specific, mobile games are games on mobile platforms. Social games would be games that are played on social networks, be they Facebook, Twitter, Tagged, and others. Games that by design are built upon social graphs or enable special features because of the social graph is available to the game and the designer. Now, where we've seen a number of games try to do that is they're basically exploiting the social graph to spam your friends and get more people to play their game and spend money. But you are starting to see things move beyond that, especially in the healthcare space. There's a lot of interest in using social games to have your friends being part of an influencing circle of play or even spectator to your play. So that's an opportunity to talk about. So on the mobile game space, there's a large sort of landscape of things that people are developing. You know, connected sensors, mobile phones, smartphones, feature phones. I mean, in the U.S. and in Europe, you know, we really heavily talk about, you know, the day and time of smartphones, but a lot of older patient populations are still on simpler mobile phones or feature phones, or as a discussion I just had, in international, you know, some of the more emerging markets, Africa, Southeast Asia, I mean, you have a lot of people who are, you know, on something not much better than an SMS-capable phone, and have people actually done games and other things on those? The answer is yes. In fact, ZMQ Software in India has done a mobile trivia game for HIV in India, and I think they reached something like 10 million people with it over a course of time, had carrier buy-in, so on and so forth. So it's important to think of mobile going across a lot of different areas, despite the fact that, you know, obviously smartphones is the big area. Tablets is now a humongous area as well. When you look at handheld video games, which is now being sort of taken over by iPhones, Android phones, it's really interesting. Last year at Games for Health, we had a session called the Nintendo DS, the greatest Games for Health platform that's ever existed, because in the early goings with the DS was a huge installed base. The amount of health games that were developed for the Nintendo DS in both Europe, North America, and especially in Japan was incredible. And in fact, there's some really innovative work that still exists only on that platform, yet to be translated into these other platforms. So it's important to understand not only where things are today, but where there are bastions of work to learn from. You know, when you look at the comparisons of some of these, again, you can look at, you know, the modality of mobility, what their functional profile is, in terms of what people are really doing with these things, what kinds of users are going on, whether or not, you know, these are shared devices. And shared can mean a couple of things. So think about a tablet. It might be shared amongst a household individually. But there are a whole bunch of great tablet games. I've built a collection of them. There's been several articles in game development magazines talking about multiple people playing at the same tablet. So the tablet now becomes a communicative device between multiple people at the same time. And this is very interesting because you can think about the tablet being something that a doctor or a health professional and a patient could play a game together, and it becomes a form of communication between them, such as negotiating a care plan. Instead of the tablet being like this, where the doctor is is using it and the patient's on the other side, I think the tablet should be seen as like the world's most ultimate board game. And so thinking about a design pattern that works that way as well. But the big picture is this notion that we have a lot of things that are built on mobile platforms as opposed to building for mobile. And I think it's important to look when you're really trying to innovate, when you're really trying to see where there's breakthrough opportunities, to be thinking as much about building for mobile as opposed to just building on. And so building on mobile is just an app that runs on a mobile device, and it's accessible via mobile platform browsers, or it's an app. And there are certainly inherent advantages, pervasive advantages that we get from putting what would be a otherwise desktop application on these platforms. But when we look at building for mobile, it's really the art of creating an application that takes advantage of the mobility of the platform overall, or even increasingly the types of functions that exist only on these platforms, such as the camera, such as the ability for GPS, such as, I'm seeing prototypes with things like where this is sensitized for galvanic skin response, other types of things that we'll be seeing going on these. So then when you're building for mobile, you're thinking about all of these different ideas, small moments of time, different parts of the day, input systems, communications, being able to be played with one hand, the idea that, through increasingly notification systems, we now have an interruptive platform that can interrupt you in your day, both good and bad. We could look at geolocation. We can look at the proximity to a person or an object. So as RFID becomes more and more available through these platforms, now all of a sudden it can react to things that are tagged as well. And then, of course, you've got all these other kinds of platforms. We talked about the microphone. All of these have microphones. Same with your phones. Earlier I showed a picture of Lit to Quit, where somebody is actually blowing into the microphone to do a breathing exercise that has been shown previously, before the game was even developed, to be something that helps with people who are craving cigarettes. And they can actually modulate and build a game reaction just based upon the microphone and what happens with that. There's actually a whole series of games, not smoking, but that have been built on that whole idea of sounds, of breathing, and the microphone's ability to pick that up and regulate it. So ideas are easy in that sense. The majority of mobile apps are basically apps on mobile platforms. It's easy to say, I'd like to just do this, but do it on a mobile device. It's much harder to make that unique mobile experience. So when you have to start to define what a unique mobile experience might be. I really am spending a lot of time thinking about these as mobile sensor platforms. And if you look at the trajectories of where things are going, we're going to see more and more ability for these things to sense the environment, to sense the person that they're dealing with. Whether it's the way Google Goggles now works, where it can pick up, you can point the camera at an object and it can tell you what it is visually, to even the ability like something like Shazam, where it literally can match a song or other types of environmental noise. And then of course with Bluetooth, these things could be the platform that talk to the wearable sensors that we have that aren't even built in. So how do you do that, and how can you build some really interesting associated psychology and situational play as you start to get at that? Of course, this is also a platform that's filled with lawsuits. And so that, how these systems create ubiquity is under challenge at times. Here's just some examples. Nido Games has done some stuff with wearable sensor platforms. We did a project for Humana called Goldwalker. That was a game that just used the accelerometer in an iPhone to create a game where you explored the 1849 California gold rush, moving resources around. Every single number that you see on there is a caloric value that you have to achieve in order to move your character around the board. There's other actions that have to take place as well. University of Houston's done some just simple walk-and play games. What they were doing this for was actually to incentivize wearing of a software pedometer that they were doing that was highly calibrated. And this is actually the underlying pedometer engine that we used for Goal Walker. There's really inventive stuff. Mad Dash was a game that was done at the Carnegie Mellon University, and what this was, along with some other things they were doing, was it's a game you play with a kid, and you basically photograph them doing interesting sort of things in the world outside, playing and building stories and other things just using the mobile phone camera. Akoha has done, they're a startup that's now failed, but they were one of the first early groups of doing these sort of goal-setting game apps. You know, eat a healthy meal, take a friend out for a walk, and then, you know, using self-reporting and then a gamification type approach to leveling up. I would argue this is sort of was the first version of something like Super Better, Mind Bloom, and others. Another really interesting example was Colorfall from Persuasive Games. This is a simple Tetris-like game where you're trying to build rows of matching colors of squares. Now, the next square that's going to fall is of a certain color, but if you really need another one, you can interrupt it, use your camera, and go find that color out in the world around you and replace it with it. You know, is this going to be a game that solves obesity? No. But it's a really interesting idea, and it's the types of things that we're trying to get out into our community on a prototype level that show the inventiveness of what a mobile game could be. I've seen other ones that do this with turning Wi-Fi, open Wi-Fi relays into a random seed that then generates a treasure. So you now have your device and you're walking around town trying to find unique hotspot names in order to collect things. We've seen things like Eat This, Not That. The Mindless Eating Challenge and that work, J.P. Pollack, who was actually here this week, this was some work, research done at Cornell looking at nutrition behavior change on mobile platforms. There's Lit to Quit. This is being built at Columbia University Teachers College, and you can Google, they have some research results and other aspects, but you could see there he's actually blowing into the phone as part of this sort of abstract game that generates this breathing therapy that's been shown as effective as part of a smoking cessation intervention. Zombies Run. How many people have played Zombies Run? Very interesting sort of game, out and running, audio sort of feedback. Very inventive new game that you should check out. We had down in our booth, this was, again, that board game-like approach. They actually, this is from the Tilt Factor group at Dartmouth, dealing with a game that sort of explains how inoculation and stopping the spread of pandemics can work. But they did an actual board game version, and then they translated the board game to the iPad. And again, this is one of those games where you could sit it down and you could play two people or more at the table. Hot Seat from Context Communication and MadPow. This is a sort of gamified application that's built against sitting disease. So you schedule or you build challenges or your friends send you challenges of simple little exercises you can do throughout the day, and it generates these sort of interruptive moments where you're challenged to fulfill those opportunities, doing those things, and then as a result, gaining points, leveling up, competing against friends and other cohorts, and using those kinds of principles around that, thinking about these very short interruptions just to get you up and out of your seat, breaking up that sort of sitting disease paradigm. We've seen a number of pedometer type things. Strive had their own actual pedometer that had its own screen and applications. They've now also translated to iPhone and Android. GeoPals is doing a sort of USB sensor with an application. They're sort of aimed more at like about a sub-9-year-old framework. This was actually started by the guy, Rich Smelzer, who was responsible for creating Gibbets, which were those little add-ons that you put on Crocs. The kids, and his vision is actually to get the pedometer down small enough to put it in that, so that, and then to have a portal that goes with it. So we're as funny as that may sound, you know, when I was joking with him about it, he says, "Don't forget, you know, we had gibbets up to hundreds of millions of dollars." So I think it's very interesting to see that kind of entrepreneurship in the space. Runkeeper, of course, one of the most popular run tracking systems, now also has a variety of sort of web-based apps that then connect to your Runkeeper data and that represent a sort of app platform on Runkeeper that has been extended into gameplay. A lot of these are sort of gamification type systems that exist on top of Runkeeper's API. MindBloom, SuperBetter represent a number of sort of goal-setting apps, gamified goal-setting apps that people can install, and many are using and are geared towards healthcare goals, be it anywhere from dieting to weight loss to overcoming a particular health condition. Healthy Heroes is a pedometer-based game that came out of Sweden. And then elsewhere in Europe, we also have iLumens, which is done an iPad game simulation for first aid. So first aid training. So you can see that the spectrum of things that are being built go from, you know, simpler sort of goal-setting, gamified apps for pedometers and things, all the way up to full-blast simulations and training products. Scavenger, of course, has moved on to other things, but there are a number of people that have been building toolkits for mapped-based games that can be enjoyed across multiple mobile platforms. I think there's still a lot of rich opportunity in this space that hasn't really been as explored as well, especially around storytelling and otherwise. And of course, you know, not everything has to be perfectly geolocation-based, including being inside buildings and otherwise. You know, there's a number of these sort of QR codes and all kinds of other types of things that allow you to tag information in the world and build games and gamification kind of experiences around that. The ability to interact with the environment, either the built environment or the natural environment, is something that's still a very emergent activity with these games. We've only seen a few. I think we're sort of starting to see more, but only a few that have done some truly amazing pieces of work. There's actually going to be some contests, I think, hitting very, very soon to encourage some more development of these types of things. In terms of social games, I want to skip over that for a sec, but there are a lot of different social game platforms. I think what's important to understand, at least about the social game space, let alone the mobile social space, is that while Facebook and then to some extent Twitter are very, very much the prevalent platforms that people are looking at, the vast majority of things are being built on Facebook, only a few things being built on Twitter. When we've looked at work in this space in terms of health and healthcare, it's been interesting in terms of health research to look at some of the smaller social networks that are developing, like Tagged and others, many of which, from an interesting health nugget, support anonymous styles of social accounts, which could be very, very interesting from a health behavior investigatory standpoint. So the issue of having a real named account in Facebook and then coupling that with exploration of a sensitive health topic versus some of these other environments may give you something quite different. Ultimately, though, there's an issue around mechanics and audience. Here's just some examples. Here, challenge your friends. A lot of these things have been sort of using games to just generate more audience, generate more sort of social involvement. Things like mHealth has done some simple things with like Daily Challenge, their Community Clash platform, their Monumental game. They're now moving into some higher level things and combining mobile and social networks for more advanced gameplay and health interventions related around that. Health Seeker was one of the early games that Yogo has done. It's very interesting if you had time to spend with them in their booth, how far along they've come from some of their early social health games to the things that they're doing today, like Diabetes and I Heart Jellyfish and others. Health Month was another game that has come out, doesn't look too much like a game the way we would think about it from an Xbox or a game player perspective, But setting up multiple goals, setting up smaller steps, challenges, levels that you can attain, and building those towards a larger set of motivated outcomes. Foursquare has done, represents sort of one of the early gamification platforms, of course, mobile and location-based. But, they've done some things like a healthy eating badge that CNN sponsored, sort of trying to marry opportunities in health with the platform that they have as a simple early example of some of the things they've done. Farmville, of course, one of the most popular, often played social games. Again, they did some experimentation mostly around commercialization of their platform, but at one point Cascadian Farms did some things where you could earn some special blueberry bushes if you bought that, or broccoli. I think they did one. But, laugh as we may, I believe Cascadian Farms said that the growth in their sales for the few weeks that these promotions ran were way off the charts in terms of the motivation that they were getting. Of course, there's ways to get tripped up by this as well. When we saw there was some things with some of the early social games where in order to monetize them for people who were refusing to give money in terms of the monetization, Facebook and others were letting them take on alternative things that they could do, filling out forms, providing credit information, and others in order to gain that virtual currency. And so, that got some people into some hot water. Some of the patterns that you see that are simple on here, it's just go from things like asking, this sort of goal-setting app that then turns around and interrupts you throughout the day and say, do this to earn that. We're seeing things just accelerometer and exertion, so the accelerometer can measure activity. The GPS can also not only respond to your environment, but also can measure activity. Another just general pattern is this notion of what am I doing versus my friends. So setting up through mobile social, just the ability to motivate yourself. Here's how long you walked today, but here's how long all of your social network did. Trying to arbitrage that for motivation. And then just this notion of a check-in, like the way Foursquare or other things work. Your mobile phone's with you. We can ideally try to get you to check in. A lot of this generating around this notion of self-report. However, most self-report up until now, even on mobile platforms, has been the equivalent of a traditional self-report diary. And the real challenge is to turn these sensor platforms and these other types of things into something that doesn't seem like a chore or does it for you automatically, such that you are now reacting to the notion that you're instrumented. So if I have a pedometer that I know is tracking me and is sending that information, I don't even have to do anything but wear it, but I know now that the game is going to reward me for certain actions, I don't need to be interrupted. I don't need to be complicit in providing that information, but I now start to make behavior changes because I know what they tie to in terms of a game, and I'll eventually check into the game itself, but I'll see those results from all of that passive gameplay. And that's kind of where we're headed. Ultimately, what we're going to get out of this is the evolution of these sensor platforms, and we're going to get more to this idea, of games on mobile. I mean, we're going to get past, I think, this notion of games on mobile and get more onto this notion of really mobile games and what they give us. And, even though we have mobile and social that have grown up quite a bit in parallel, we're still only starting to see the early explorations and results of combining those two things together. Every day for the last year in game development media, there's been a lot of discussion of how rapidly the social game companies that grew up so quickly in that gold rush are trying to transition to mobile and are still behind in that experience, and really seeing the best of that marriage come to happen. But ultimately, right now, we're still, I think, especially in healthcare, really, really wide open. But the experimentation so far, I think, has been costly, which is why we still haven't seen a ton of it. So I'll end there. It's just a broad outline, and I'll let Dan from Zamzi show you one of the, real, true, bona fide products that have come out in this space and are rapidly scaling up. Do you get to jump the line?
No, someplace.
So what's it worth?
Shaken Out gives you like a free soda.
That's wonderful.
I'm sure your parents are very proud. Welcome. Thank you all for sticking around at the end of a great conference. Welcome. My name is Dan Botwinick, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Zamzy. Alan talked a lot about the research and the background. I'm going to try to give you some insights into the design. I'm the Director of Program Development, and I work with healthcare providers and payers and schools and community programs, employee wellness programs, to design programs that really help deploy Zamzy on the ground to be successful in their specific social context. As Ellen mentioned, Zamzy was born out of research from Hope Lab. They spun us out, provided us seed funding, and here we are trying to build a business out of it. We try to start everything we do with who we are really here for and here to serve. We are very mission-driven. Meet Cindy. Actually, this is not Cindy. These are Cindy's 3 children. Her oldest daughter is overweight, her middle child is overweight, and she herself, Cindy, not pictured here, is obese. She was ashamed of herself. Her pediatrician told her kids were at risk. He encouraged her to attend a camp that will improve their health and help start to change their behavior. She came to us through that camp. She was ashamed and committed and dedicated and pessimistic, and because she felt that the task in front of her was really hard. Change is really, really hard. She was not alone in what she was worrying about. USA Today had a recent report saying that adults rate sedentary behavior as the #1 health concern facing kids, which is really shocking if you think about all of the health concerns facing kids. Sedentary behavior was rated #1, which really speaks to the breadth of the issue. They rate this as a #1 concern with actually very good reason. Physically active children have 40% higher test scores, are 15% more likely to go to college, and by the time they are adults, they save $2,700 a year in healthcare costs. Physical activity is really a game changer in the life of a child. The problem is physical activity really declines dramatically during adolescence. The trends are, I'm sure a lot of you know the trends quite well. 80% of 13 to 15-year-olds don't get the recommended amount of activity. In fact, for every hour a 9-year-old spends moving around, that same kid as a 15-year-old moves around for only 15 minutes. And so these trends are very significant. And not only are the trends significant, but the consequences are equally significant. Physical inactivity significantly contributes to the global burden of non-communicable diseases, such as cancer, stroke, and heart disease. It also has serious psychological consequences like anxiety, stress, and depression. The good news is that it's not an insurmountable lift to turn it around, and I think this is really an important insight into building a game. We didn't try to, we tried to make a material but modest behavior change. 15 to 30 minutes of walking per day can reduce your risk of cancer, heart disease, stroke, and diabetes. And so we knew that this was something that was really in reach. And the other important thing, which is why we're so focused on kids, we know that starting kids young predicts adult behavior quite well. Kids that positively experience physical activity before the age of 10 are far more likely to be physically active throughout their entire life. So we asked ourselves, with this massive slowdown in physical activity, and we're not the only people talking about this. Michelle Obama, for one. Lots of organizations are really focused on this. We asked ourselves, how can we help this big issue? And we really started with this point of behavior change, not the tracking and just sort of straight encouragement, but rather behavior change. Ellen mentioned it earlier. I think how hard it is for me to change my behavior, to eat better, to do anything. Now imagine being 12 and filled with insecurity about body image and self-perception, let alone a 12-year-old who already is on the higher end of the obesity scale. At 12, it is far scarier and much harder to stick with something that contradicts the behaviors of your peers, makes you feel socially vulnerable, and generally pushes you out of your comfort zone. And so we really tried to ground our challenge in that feeling and that reality. And so we came up with Zamzy, a fun gaming experience that's deeply entrenched in the research on how to motivate regular exercise and the lessons of video game design. Great games have just the right combination of challenges and motivators to ensure all players are successful, where knowledge gained through failure, say launching an angry bird at a green pig, can be directly applied towards a second chance where success is much more likely. So the challenge for us was to use that psychology and the tricks of game design to help kids who aren't sporty experience physical activity in a fun way that's more similar to gaming and therefore less intimidating. So that is where we started. The first step is to measure. So we built the Zamzy meter. It's a high-tech little device that measures the time and intensity of activity. So we can not only see sedentary behavior, but we can actually distinguish between moderate and vigorous activity. This allows us to acknowledge baby steps in the right direction. So if a kid's entirely sedentary, we want to reward and praise them for moderate activity or an increase in moderate activity. But it also allows us to track the clinically meaningful, vigorous exercise, which is something that their healthcare providers often care about. We also designed this with a lot of input of kids. Ellen talked a lot about the iterative design process, very research-based design process that Hope Lab drives. But the reality is, at the end of the day, if the kids don't like it and the kids don't wear it, then it doesn't work, no matter how good it works in theory. So we really tried to ground the design in that. Interestingly, when Zamzy was first just a seed of an idea, the world was very different. There was a Nike Plus, but there was no Nike Fuel Band, and there was certainly no Fitbit. And so things have really evolved as we've kind of worked through this research process, which is exciting, actually. It kind of, now we just say, oh, it's Fitbit for kids, everybody gets it. 5 years ago, that it would take a lot more explanation. Ellen talked a little bit about our design philosophy and the camper framework. I'm offering the distinction of adding a pretty picture to that. But I just want to walk you through how we apply this framework in the design of the experience. And again, this is stuff that's really highly leveraged from the existing literature. We didn't make this up, but rather we used it as a guide as we developed and studied. So I want to start with the extrinsic rewards aspect. These motivators, these are extrinsic motivators that are disguised as gift cards, pink duct tape, sparkle lip gloss, other things like that, remote control helicopters, you name it. We actually did extensive research in the process to think through how big the rewards should be. What was enough to get kids interesting, but not too much to actually squelch the development of intrinsic motivation, because there is research to say that if you over-reward, you squelch the development of that. So it's about getting that right. And if you go to the Hope Lab website, hopelab.org/Zamzy, there are a couple of slides in there that actually speak to the data on that. So we really optimized our algorithms based on that research data. But it's also worth noting that buying the rewards is a really fun part of what we do. Interestingly, actually, I want to add that we do also have a lot of charitable donations, and so kids can earn rewards and then apply those rewards towards charitable donations instead of, say, a gift card. And that's a pretty popular thing that we do. The most popular charity is the ASPCA, which I think is also really insightful. So onto the part of the site where we try to foster that positive mindset, where we try to move past the extrinsic to try to internalize some of these behaviors. The heart of the experience of the My Zamzy page, that's pictured here. Of course, you're going to explore this whole world. You need a whole new identity, and that's why we really spend a lot of energy making sure our avatars are interesting and noteworthy. It's a great device for giving kids a sense of freedom, expression, and control. They can design their avatar to be representations of themselves. They can earn extra currency to trick out their avatar in even cooler costumes and so on and so forth. And they can really use their avatar to be an expression of who they are inside and out. A lot of kids' gameplay is avatar-based. And so again, this is nothing new, but something that was really important to our experience and is a big part of what kids enjoy doing in our world. Tracking how much you move, obviously very important, is a big part of it. So that's a key part of the experience. In Zamzy, you get points for every minute of moderate to vigorous physical activity. We call that in the zone. So you get points for being for minutes in the zone. What's different about Zamzy is that we actually reward kids for improvement, not just gross performance. In our system, these blue stars here, kids earn bonus points for beating their rolling 14-day average. And so this taps into that kids need to feel capable and effective that we talked about in our camper framework. And so what we've done here is we've used the game design to move the bar so that every kid can be successful as long as they stay engaged and improve. And that's a really important part about what we do. So a game wouldn't be a game, of course, without levels and badges, currency, and adventures. These all are common game mechanics that we deploy. They represent opportunities for kids to set and achieve goals. That's the mastery of our framework. They vary in difficulty so that kids of all skill and activity level can achieve success and start to establish the positive mindset that's so critical to behavior change. Just give you a little bit more detail about these. So we have levels. You earn points and you break through different levels. And you earn badges for different behaviors. Some of them are oriented towards physical activity. Some of them are oriented towards engaging in the site. Because we know if you stay engaged in the site, you're more likely to stay active. So we try to encourage that behavior as well. And then we have something called challenges. Challenges are our key kind of currency generator. So the kid will take a specific challenge, and it'll be written as a mini story. You're running for school president. It's far more humorous and elegant than I'm describing it now. You can check them out on our site. But you're running for school president, and so you need to run around and like get your name out there and sidewalk chalk the neighborhood. Earn 30 points in the next 20 minutes and earn 50 ZAMs. And so ZAMs are currency in our site that can be counted towards rewards. So we try to create fun little adventure stories that are sort of context for just going out and taking on a physical challenge. Doesn't matter what you do specifically, but rather just go out and be active. And that's kind of the context where you earn those points. And kids really get into them. It's a very, very popular part of what we do. It also is a way for us to kind of manage the economy, which is obviously a key part of the business model. Another key aspect of building the positive mindset is relatedness, building fun social features that make kids feel connected to each other. This is made a bit tricky with respect to kids and internet safety. So we really have to be smart about that. It's not that hard to be smart about it. The guidelines are pretty clear. So we created WHAMs. WHAMs are a highly, highly popular feature on our site that you can really think of as Twitter meets Mad Libs. Use drop-down menus that the kids can tell the world what they are up to. And so you see that's the what, where, and how of the drop-down menu, and then you can announce the world what we're up to. So we populate these drop-down menus with silly and serious things. And the results of these WHAMs can range from the ridiculous, like getting real on a spaceship and making it epic, to the profound, such as living life and loving it. And so WHAMs are really a great way. One thing that really amazes me is how frequently the new WHAMs pop up on the site. And so anytime I look at our site, it's 1 minute ago, 2 minutes ago, 3 minutes ago, and it's exciting to see so many kids so engaged. So of course all this intentionality is great, but does it really work? Ellen walked through the data. I'm not going to walk through it again. We think the data is pretty compelling. We're pretty excited about it. Ellen mentioned we had the 6-month study. We saw kids move 59% more, and the girls moved 103% more. Kids with a high BMI moved 27% more. We saw this impact sustained over a 6-month period. It was not a short-lived thing. And every week, week in and week out, kids in the Zamzi group moved more than the control group. And also, obviously, quite compelling is, they were so Hope Lab folks were very curious, did all this extra activity have an impact on biology? And as Ellen noted, it did. We saw positive movement on both LDL cholesterol and glycated hemoglobin. So overall, these were results that we were really, really excited about, as you can imagine. There was a lot of buzz that day in the office when we first started to hear this stuff. And so it's great and has really helped us. So as you know, the data is important, but what's really important are stories like Cindy's. And so she used Zamzi for several months, and she wrote us that she's never seen such a change in her daughters. She can honestly say that Zamzi's been one of the best motivators to keep her family focused on having fun, getting fit, and being more active as a family. And the key thing here is family. Implicit in a lot of what Ben said, implicit in a lot of the game design, social networks, whatever they may be, foster adherence. That is probably the most obvious thing anybody said all week. But for kids, that means their parents, their friends, et cetera. And actually 20% of of our users are adults, are 18 plus, and a lot of those are parents who are doing that with their kids. And we have family features and so on that allow parents to be a part of the process with their kids. Which is, in this particular issue, these are often family-wide issues. It's not like you have a family of athletes with one kid struggling with physical activity, but rather it's just a full family issue. So if we can engage the whole family, that for us is the biggest possible win. Again, something Ellen mentioned earlier is a mantra that we really live by, which is that if you lead with fun, health will follow. So we try to have everything be fun. For kids, we are a game that get kids moving. We are not a physical activity and obesity intervention prevention tool. We are a game that gets kids moving. You earn cool rewards, trick out your avatar, etc. That's it, first and foremost. That's it. Thanks very much.
We have an opportunity to take some questions and further discussion. Let me just say, just because it has finally been announced, I couldn't talk about it before, but Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which also underwrites the Games for Health project, has partnered up with the Health 2.0 team and is announcing a $200,000 games challenge. It's the Aligning Forces for Quality Games to Generate Data challenge. Participating technology developers will create game applications that generate useful healthcare quality data to improve health and healthcare. The games challenge will be conducted in 2 phases. Phase 1 is an open ideation phase for interested developer teams to submit application concepts. So you don't even have to develop anything, just a 5 to 8 template like PowerPoint sort of storyboard. And then in Phase 2, the top 5 development teams from Phase 1 will build upon their initial proposals and create video game, working game applications. The developer of the winning game app will receive $100,000. Second place will receive $50,000. Third place will be awarded $25,000. Now, just in case you're mathematically challenged, there is $25,000 missing from that. That actually is part of a prize package, I believe, in the first phase of the contest. The winners will be announced in September 2013. First place winner will present at the annual Fall Health 2.0 conference. The Games for Health project is actually a partner in this event, in this effort, and we'll be releasing more information and resources as well throughout this, the rest of this year and next in support of this. What's unique about this in terms of a mobile perspective is, unlike a number of game challenges or ideas for games have been built around this notion of using games that are based upon existing data sets, what I think makes this interesting and where mobile could be quite an interesting element of it is the ability to create a game that generates data and the kind of data that then helps us build a healthier world. So a little bit of a twist on the current en vogue data palooza type stuff. And so something worth hopefully participating in. And you'll find details, I believe, directly on Health 2.0's website at what is the health2con.com. You'll find all of that information. So that's finally been announced at the today at mHealth. So more games coming up. So awesome. I hope all of you win. Okay, so questions. Go right ahead.
Okay, so this might build on what you just said. Your data, do you have any platform where the data that you're getting from SAMC can go to healthcare providers like pediatricians? And the reason I ask is we have new pediatric cardiovascular guidelines, and the recommendations for pediatricians and other healthcare providers is to get an activity history of kids ages 9 through 17 and then to recommend an hour of moderate to vigorous physical activity. So this would be a great platform for them to get the history.
Absolutely. The answer is yes, we do. We have tools for clinicians where they can see the movement data of their patients if the patients sort of volunteer to get connected to that.
Oh, that's great.
And that's something that's currently in beta that's being developed in pilots with various sort of healthy eating, active living type clinics around the country. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, because nutrition and healthy eating habits are another component of the guidelines for those who care.
Yeah, this
Thanks.
has actually been a problem in the games for health space for several reasons. One of which, earlier, as I alluded, a lot of early work was done on sort of these handheld consoles, game consoles, desktop applications, often by smaller groups, be it on a computer or big companies on the consoles, and they just didn't really embrace the whole notion of connected health as much because they weren't focused on it. They didn't necessarily see a business model behind that, as well as just the pure hurdles technically of doing that on some of these platforms. Of course, we do know what's going to drive these things, and it will be those types of connections, and I think that the next wave of things coming through will enable that. There's also some companies that are working on building the kind of middleware tool sets that make it easier for small development teams to immediately start building in those capabilities. By disclosure, I've done some work for one of them, Elbrus Networks, but I mean, the idea that there's going to be multiple groups kind of doing this, as well as even just looking like, the challenge that was here this week with Cigna's challenge. I mean, a data API that's opened up that you can go and do stuff. So that world's going to, I think, change quite quickly. But then the challenge is going to be for the health professionals, the clinicians and stuff to take advantage of that, whether end to end, introducing the ZMC to them when they come to the office, and then having some sort of interaction throughout that process, whether it be with the kid directly or with the parents. In other respects, the other thing that's very interesting about all games, let alone games on mobile platforms, is because there's such a high frequency of decision being made in a lot of good games. A lot of these games are now increasingly instrumented themselves. So I know on a project that we're doing, we're going to get every bit and piece of the gameplay captured into a large database during a clinical trial, and then we're going to have the ability to look at that data against the data from out-of-game instruments, be they forms, be they qualitative follow-up, depth any number of instruments, and then being able to cross-validate that and look at what's going on in the game as well as the results outside of the game is something, I mean, yes, you can instrument certain apps, but when you see what the amount of data an instrumented game creates versus some of the other things, it's excitingly night and day in terms of what you're looking at. And so there's some really, really interesting and underutilized opportunities here. Any further questions? Yes, go ahead.
Middle schoolers is really what we're optimized for. We have stories above and below that. We found that kids as young as 5, if they have an older sibling that they're sort of role modeling the behavior of, that works fine. And older kids who are maybe particularly interested in sort of social media or gaming, that also works fine. But really, our main focus has been on middle schoolers, and so the schools we work with are middle schools and so on. Yeah.
If you were to practice for adults, like what would be some of the main challenges?
Gosh. I think it's a very different challenge. I mean, there's so many people, we often, to someone who's never heard of us before, they often either say to me, it's like Fitbit for kids, or I say to them, it's like Fitbit for kids. So there's so much out there. For us, our interest is not, but all those adult plays are all about measure and motivate. Measure, and then the motivation will, they don't really care. It's sort of like a gym. The best gym member is the one who never comes. They just send a check every week. But we're really dedicated to the motivation side. So I'd really want to spend a lot of time thinking about what are the emotional needs that sort of drive motivation and behavior change at that population is how I would start with it. I think it would be probably a very different site. I don't know. In some ways, yeah, because kids are motivated by a $5 gift card to GameStop is pretty cool if you don't have any income, and so yeah, maybe on some level it is. I mean, for us, we're Hope Lab as an organization is really our genesis. Really passionate about helping improve health outcomes in children, and so we just sort of we just started there.
I think that you'll see I mean, I already talked about some of them earlier. You're going to see these types of activity-inducing or even games that you're playing that are active games themselves, as well as trackers and things. But what I think what you're seeing right now with Zamzy, GeoPals as well, or even Fitbit, is a sort of integrated model of application that sits next to a particular device. But I think over time you're going to see those decouple.
Yeah.
And you're going to see Zamzy work with a Fitbit,
That's right.
or Zamzy work with any number of pedometer or active, or even just with the phone. You know, there'll be different reasons you'll want one type of device versus another. And then, you know, you'll even maybe see things where Zamzy is a gamification rewards platform, then playing on top of a audio adventure game that then is running on top of a Fitbit. And that's where things are going. But I think in order to get to market and have that quality intervention that was measured against their clinical trial, you know, they went for that perfect approach, because that other day and time it's just not available yet. The infrastructure is not in place. So, next.
Thank you very much. I'm involved with a charity here called DC Scores, part of the America Scores group, and they take inner city middle schoolers and now working into high schoolers and involve them in soccer. So the average DC public school kid gets 45 minutes of physical education a week. They multiply that by 9 for DC Scores. And then they do some poetry as well in spoken word, which is kind of a different thing with it. But nonetheless, do you guys have a specific strategy? Well, first of all, are you doing well in inner city underprivileged markets, or do you have a specific strategy to get into the inner city underprivileged market?
Sort of, and yes. One of the things that we do, I sort of mentioned my role as the head of program development. We work with the organizations to really get the programs to work well in that context. It's a lot of it I sort of call is we try to solve for reality. I lost it, I broke it, I don't have internet connection, I moved, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In inner city communities, those problems are compounded 100-fold. And so we have done a lot of programs in urban school districts, some of our research within urban school districts, and the programmatic requirements to make those successful just requires more on-the-ground resources, probably more kind of Android and mobile development on our part. Like so before we can sort of fully be realized in those social contexts, I think we have some work to do. And we compensate for those shortcomings by having like really present, on-the-ground, you know, program support. And so it's a huge part of our mission is to reach those kids. And it's just we're really in the early stages of learning how to make that work and what the development requirements are. One thing we hear a ton is a lot of these kids don't have computers at home or internet access at home, but other parents have Android smartphones. And so that's the kind of thing that but we're a USB website, you know. So we're learning about all of those little details that really make the difference between successful implementation and not. And it's just time and patience to solve for all of them.
Yeah, you may have success trying to go through charitable organizations,
Yeah.
you know, with more structure. That you know, someone like this DC Scores, where these kids are involved 5 days a week directly with. It's based out of the schools. Schools have computers.
That's right. That's where it works the best, where we have on-the-ground support and sort of champions that can really help make it work.
I've actually seen several products and experiments where they're putting the accelerometers in the soccer balls and trying to create different types of things with it. I don't know what they've achieved, but there's people playing
Broken
even
accelerometers.
directly. Well, no, like really, stuff like that. Yeah, yeah. I mean, so there's some things like that are going on that people are playing with. Yes.
Yeah, I was just curious. Great discussions and demo. Thank you. On the testing front, there are so many devices and operating systems, coming up. People say it's fragmented. I was just curious. You do have any automation tool to test these games, even including the social networking platform? What you have? Any plans you have, or any you check it on devices?
To bring Zamzy out of the sort of the standard PC laptop environment into mobile platforms, social platforms, et cetera. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's absolutely part of the roadmap. I mean, I think mobile is probably our first next step. Social networks like Facebook, for The bulk of our users are 13 and under, and so due to the guidelines in the Child Online Privacy Protection Act, we tend to steer clear, even though lots and lots of those kids are on Facebook, but that's not, we're not going there. And so, but I think the mobile platforms is probably our next big thing. There's a lot happening in Bluetooth that makes it a lot more feasible, and so it's definitely on the very short-term roadmap.
Hi, it's a really interesting discussion, and this is more of a general question, but I'm just interested in what we can learn from the approaches taken for games and gamification for kids and adolescents, and what lessons can be learnt in translating that to the elderly and people with chronic conditions and a different demographic who won't necessarily respond to the same sorts of extrinsic and intrinsic motivating factors, and what experience we have so far in the research on that.
There are a number of people, most of the work in the game space around sort of, say, seniors and stuff, I think has been around gamification, around cognitive rehab and improvement, some of which is got some interesting efficacy and some of which has got some questionable efficacy. But the second area where we've seen is sensory motor rehab, so Parkinson's and other places, and there's been some really, really good work there. Stroke victims, stroke patients, excuse me, is another area. I've heard and seen bits and pieces of things done around isolation, but not a lot of what I would consider, I haven't come across great work there, but I do think you're going to see a bunch there. What's interesting in terms of some of the stuff in terms of older senior populations has been there's sort of three things. One is they represent the largest group of people who have free time to play games, and they tend to also want to play games with their grandkids. I've yet to see someone really exploit that in an interesting health sort of space. So we've actually had discussions with people doing cognitive training where kids and grandparents could play together, and it could be even a way to monitor, remote monitoring. How well are people doing? Because the interesting thing with some cognitive capacities is that if you do a one-time test, you may not catch something. That it's really over a multiple sort of temporal value that you start to pick up on potential early onset decline. Another sort of area in terms of that is that designing for very young, or even in the case we do a lot of work in accessibility, regardless of age, but a lot of that design and work and effort towards sort of simpler, accessible gameplay tends to match up really well with older populations. And then finally, I mean, in terms of computing platforms, I mean, adoption of computing platforms, mobile phones among seniors versus, say, desktop computers, and their interest in playing games on those platforms, at least anecdotally from my observations, has been really interesting and potentially represents a place to see more activity. I mean, my mom actually plays Angry Birds and others, and the naturalistic of the touchscreen interface, I think, has similarly driven young kids and seniors, and we saw this as well with the Wii. Gross body motor movement type interfaces have been very accessible, and so that's driven some of the opportunity. And then, of course, the average age of a game player in North America is close to 40. So we're starting to just see a war of attrition, so to speak, in terms of adoption of gameplay. I guess I'd say as a final piece, a lot of the interesting games on tablets and other things tend to be not just tend to be inventive, sort of turn-based type stuff. The type of pacing and interfaces that I think are more look more familiar to, say, somebody who hasn't necessarily grew up and partaked in countless hours of World of Warcraft or Halo or Call of Duty. So whether or not that's all translated into some great health-based games, not quite yet, but I think the opportunity is very, very good.
Ben, my question is going to build on the question about older adults and the gamification of applications for them. You were just speaking about gamification for older adults in the context of the activity being the game itself, you know, like the cognitive rehab products, things like that. I'm interested in extending that and delving in a little bit to the Zamsi model of gamifying offline behavior as a way of modifying behavior. And I'd like, if you can, to give us a little bit more detail about, you talked about different motivators, the leveling up, the badges, the challenges. I'm very interested in what specifically, how specifically each of those is used, which ones are most effective. Do you trigger them when somebody's getting a little bit less active? You issue them a challenge to sort of pull them back in, or when they've reached a new level, is there a new challenge there? How exactly do you cobble these things together to get the best behavior change?
Sure.
And then, how might those be used for older adults in particular? There must be some learning there that we can.
Sure,
that we
I can certainly
paste
speak.
over.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm happy to speak to the Zamsi experience, and you know, it's really we really looked to the world of video games to inspire us, and then couple that against the literature on motivation. Some of that is specific. I mean, there is real academic research on motivating physical activity in children, and we studied that and analyzed those studies. But there's also lots of books you can buy at the Barnes and Nobles at the airport on motivation, business psychology, and all of that kind of really started to build this framework for us. In terms of specifically what you're talking about, I think probably the key thing is to have early wins and then space the wins further apart as they progress. So in the amount of time and energy it takes to blow through the first 3 levels, it takes double that to get to the 4th level, as an example. And getting those algorithms precise takes time and attention. But that's that's number one. In terms of engaging the disengaged, what we do is we reach out to them. I mean, the thing about the disengaged is that they're actually not coming to the game to experience anything on there, so we have to reach out to them. One of the things, from a development standpoint, we're really exploring things like SMS to go even beyond that, because kids do. Email is for old people, as I'm sure many of you know. Kids don't really use email, so emailing them is only marginally effective. But we try to email them content that tries to re-engage them and recapture them. Our next step is try to SMS them content. And so, in terms of the challenges are the way that they engage with our economy. And so we try to create little fun stories, child-appropriate pieces of content that sort of wrap a sense of purpose around being physically active. So it's like, I'm having trouble coming up with a specific example, but I used a political campaign one, where it's like the kid knows they're not literally in a political campaign. They go with it. It's part of the fantasy. And then they just know, okay, my goal is I just need to move around this much for this amount of time and then accomplish that. And we let kids pace themselves through how hard those challenges are. So for some kids who are, it'd be interesting to study of whether or not we should structure the progression of those challenges or rather let them choose. We felt we needed to let them choose because we have kids on our site who are major jocks. And we look at their movement data and think, this kid must get into a lot of trouble at school because they are moving all the time. And then we look at kids who are really not moving that much. And so how can you create content for both of those categories of kids and all the points in between? So we let them choose the difficulty of those challenges. And the main difficulty is just the length of time. So it's, X exams in 5 minutes or Y exams in 120 minutes. And they go to soccer practice and then they come back. And they earn a ton of time. And so those are we just really experiment. A lot of it is trial and error. In terms of how we design that precise stuff. And the beautiful things with game design is you can do something, go to usertesting.com, which is an awesome site. You should all use it if you guys are designers. And then in an hour, you can have 5 users giving you feedback on whether or not, and you could just start to level up that way, and then you could try some more quantitative approaches, et cetera. So it's a lot of experimentation and a few big rules, like the start easy and then space out the award as you progress.
I think when it comes to gamification, there's a couple of things. One, just in terms of the data about challenges from other real people in your life. I would suspect with older people, if they have grandkids, that's a big part. I think the next level of that is how can you make that interaction meaningful beyond just a challenge? I think the big problem for gamification, especially in healthcare, is this notion of what I call like the frequency of decision as it relates to. You have a question for me? Oh, okay. You know, even a good turn-based game, you know, has like even, you know, let's say chess not amongst grandmasters. I mean, people are making a move or thinking about a move at you know, every minute, every couple of minutes. You know, checkers with a kid, or a video game, it's, you know, it could be 60 frames a second. Even fantasy sports, if you play fantasy basketball, fantasy baseball, you might be making 4 or 5 decisions in the course of a day. I think that if you want to get the kind of immersion and kind of relationship with a game, driving that frequency of decision and how you also then facilitate that too, so you make it easy. Like a lot of this self-report stuff, you know, there's a real hurdle into providing that input. I think as you make the ability for the input to be very, very easy, and you can drive up a level of frequency, you don't want to get it too high for certain lifestyles and purposes. I think that that's an area where I see at least some people's ideas of what they should be doing with gamification fail. You know, they pick, you know, stuff like, well, taking a pill. Well, that's a, you know, ideally once a day decision. Just speaking purely as a gamer and a game designer, it doesn't at least initially strike me as an easy problem to solve and make fun. Because just not as much because of the activity, but just because of the frequency. So how do you figure out how to take something like taking a pill and generate that into a 5 or 6 decision process or something that happens around it? I don't, you know, I have theories about how to do that, but they emanate from that fact, like, okay, they're just do this once. I mean, what's that game? Press here to win? Not that interesting. And
Don't do that.
right, no,
Okay.
don't do that. You know, so I think the other part with gamification is a lot of gamification has been around, again, things, points, badges, levels, many of the things I see in Zamsi, although I think you've taken them into interesting areas. I think it's how do you bring even more pieces of game over, but not lose what I think gamification has also generated as a positive, which is this notion that not everybody is going to respond to a full-fledged game like Remission. You know, but I think that there is a greater sweet spot between what I've seen implemented and what I think the promise is there, and I think that's a challenge for designers. Like, how could you build storytelling into Zamsi in some way, or how could you build a, you know, for me as a game player in a lot of games, it's about having a strategic choice, not just a chore-ish choice. And the fun of making a decision, of trying to make a decision to optimize a problem. So how do you do that around something like this? So, you know, for example, it might be in the case of a pedometer game about the times of day you walk. So you're now starting to rearrange and figuring out a schedule and an idea and a strategy in order to maximize points around that. And maybe that changes every day, or maybe there's even clues that are given out, and if I can decode the clue and figure that out, then that tells me something I can do. So you start to get into something that now becomes, I think, more engaging and gets people to a higher level. Because I think the other danger of this, when I think about it from a business standpoint, you've got first mover advantage, which is great, but I think that this type of thing, and I've seen this in other gamification when I'm talking purely about gamification here, is the ability for it to be commodified. And as someone who has been to, you know, read enough business books once in a while, commodified is not something you use in a world when you're trying to raise money. First mover, yes, but then the next person, they're in trouble. So you know, the great thing is we're at that point, and I think that rather than get involved in these criticisms that all gamification is BS, and that article's been written, I would just simply say all gamification right now is commodified, and the challenge is to see who can get it up and above that. And those that do, I think will move more towards gaming on the spectrum as part of that, but not so forcefully that they'll give up some of the good things. And then there'll be those of us, myself included, that are building full-fledged games because we think there are additional comparative advantages there, situation notwithstanding. Thanks. I think, and then, the final session in the next 10 minutes schedule-wise is really just open Q&A. So we can continue, I myself can continue to answer questions that you may have on anything across the spectrum of games and health and mobile.
If anybody
Thanks.
wants to follow up on Zamzy, you can reach me at dan@zamzy.com. Nice and easy. Thanks very much.